At peace with God, Mike Rigby. And this is life eternal, that they might know thee, the only true God, and Jesus Christ, whom thou hast sent. John chapter 17, verse 3. Forward. What you are about to read is my spiritual journey to learn about myself and to meet and/or experience God. Your path will probably be totally different. Our spiritual advancements seem to be as varied as our personalities, and only a divine source seems to know the needs of each individual. It is my hope that in the pages of this text, you will be able to relate to principles or personality traits of godliness, perhaps even character attributes of deity that can be woven into the fabric of your own life. Hopefully, by learning of someone else's struggle, you may be able to comprehend God in a simple way, which will make focusing on God or recognizing the God within easier for you. If along that path you gain information which helps you to be God-like, then my life will have fulfillment and the purpose for this writing will have been accomplished. MLR. Chapter 1, Reflections. The sun beat down on our car as my wife and I sat waiting for the next few minutes to tick by. We were hoping to not be too early to my church disciplinary council. It was the 19th of July, 1994, and even though it was early evening, the sun still hung high in the sky above the mountain town of Midway, Utah, which we called home. As we walked to the foyer in the church, I could feel the presence of a host of relatives who had long since journeyed beyond this life. Only 2 years earlier, I would have dismissed such things as a figment of my imagination, but now it had become a reality I could not free myself from, nor did I have the desire to. Life and my outlook on it had changed so drastically, I was sure that to the rest of the world, I had become a kook. As our meeting time approached, we were directed to a small lobby, only to find our wait there was longer than expected. This gave me time to reflect on the past year and a half of my life. So much had changed. My attitudes had shifted so greatly. I was not the person that I used to be, and yet I could not deny all that had happened to me. Nor would I want to, for it would be to deny that I existed or that life itself was real, and we were sitting in that lobby that very moment. How could I convey the feelings and the experiences of the past year and a half to those who had never had them? Would I have believed these things myself back then if someone had come to me with the same tales? Perhaps not. In that sense, I was no different than my peers. How could I hold these men to any higher standard? My feeling was, I could not. I was about to face 15 men who had been called together to decide whether or not I had become a threat to the organization we all loved so dearly. If you have never been a member of a church or social group, you will have a hard time relating to what was about to happen. If you have, then to some degree, you should understand. I had worked side by side with these men and their wives for the past 10 years. There was only one person there with whom I was not well acquainted. In my past church experience, I had sat on a high council just like this one. I knew exactly how the protocol went, for I had been there dozens of times. As an active member of the LDS faith, your whole life revolves around church activity. There are programs for the youth of all ages and groups set up involving the women in social and charitable service. As a young man, I was expected to go on a 2-year mission. It was an experience that I looked forward to and then enjoyed to its fullest. This church had become a part of me, a part I loved and a life which gave me great satisfaction. It was who I was. It was a major element of my identity. Never in my wildest dreams had I considered the possibility of finding myself at odds with the leadership. That was so far from my way of thinking, it just hadn't crossed my mind. LDS church councils are presided over and called together by the local stake president. He is a lay minister that oversees 5 to 10 wards, which are each the equivalent of a parish or small congregation. His decision is normally the final word over the roughly 2,000 people which he serves. The council members he calls to work with him are made up of men only, who help administer policies. The decision of these men, and especially the stake president, could change the course of my life, and I knew it. For myself, I felt that I could handle it, but what about my 5 children and my wife? Their lives would change as well, and they were innocent bystanders, with no way to alter the course. My concern for them far outweighed my regard for myself. Such were my initial thoughts on that hot July evening. As we sat holding hands, I could feel my wife's support, and I wondered if even she could handle the opening of the next door. Thought after thought raced through my mind, and I went back to my first recollections of how I had come to be where I was. In the year 1954, my father was drafted into the American Army. As fate would have it, he didn't get sent to Korea, but was given a 2-year stint in Germany. Being married at the time, he took my mother with him, and I was born abroad in 1955, the first child and only son in what would eventually be a family of 6. When the military service ended, we came home to Utah, where I spent the next 17 years in a small suburb of Salt Lake City called Holiday. I grew up under fairly normal circumstances. Despite the fact that I was being raised in a community that was and still predominantly Mormon, in my mind it had only a positive effect, giving my personality what I needed to become a normal, upstanding citizen in society. I was taught to love God and to seek to serve Him with all of my heart. I learned respect for the laws of the land and the rights of others. My parents were quite religious, but I never felt forced to be as they were, nor to act in what others would call a religious manner. I don't remember being forced to go to church. It was just expected. As I look back on it now, it was the feeling of the warmth of the spirit that kept me going, not the sense of duty to God or the fear of my parents or of some eternal damnation. Spiritual experiences were not shunned in our household, but also were not shared much outside of our home environment. While I was in the 4th grade, a boy down the street got hit by lightning and killed. Because I was 2 years younger than Scott, the boy killed, and I was in school, I was not permitted to go to the funeral. I remember my father coming home and telling me that while he was waiting for the funeral to start, he saw Scott come into the church with his deceased grandfather, then walk to the open casket, look inside, and walk away, vanishing through the church wall. This experience was rarely talked about with others outside of our family, but we were all aware of what my father had seen. It was just something that happened, and we as a family all believed it, for I never knew my father to lie. My mother, too, was prone to spiritual experiences, but was much more quiet about them than my father, feeling that these were for her personal growth alone and not to be shared. Still, the very fact that she was going through encounters of a spiritual nature herself left me knowing that these things were real and not to be feared. Just after my birth, my mother hemorrhaged and had what we would call today a near-death experience, or NDE. From that time forth, she never feared death, but seemed to feel a sense of duty towards a life's mission that would have an influence on the lives of thousands of people. I believe that she still has never wavered in trying to accomplish what she sees as her own personal responsibility to the human family. As a young boy, I felt much closer to my mother than to my father. She was my protector and playmate. I shall never forget the hours that she held me as a young child and successfully protected me from the negative influences of the world around me. It wasn't until about age 10 or 12 that I noticed I was starting to attach to my father and move away from my mother's influence. Dad is the outgoing type, and we found a mutual interest in camping and outdoor activities. His interest in the Boy Scout program always kept young men around the house, and he seemed to have a profound influence on their lives. To this day, they still come back on occasion and thank him for the time that he spent in their lives. I was raised with the same ideals as others in our community, but as I began to grow and mature, I felt that my relationship with God was not what I wanted it to be. There was always something that seemed to be missing, a void, if you like, regarding my understanding of God. I read in books of the closeness others felt with deity, and I desired to have these same intimate spiritual experiences for myself. I had a great desire to know and experience spirituality with a longing that could not be quenched. Some have a desire to excel in sports or to achieve financially, but my drive was to know God and feel the warmth of His Spirit continually. In the scriptures, I came across people like Moses who met God face to face, and I longed to have that experience of closeness or communication in my own life. The best way I can describe it is to say that I hungered and thirsted to not only see God, but to be one with Him as Jesus had said He was one with His Father. I believe deeply that the experiences of others, such as Christ, were true, and that it was possible for me to do the same. I also knew that it would take a commitment on my part, but at the time I had little understanding or comprehension of how complete that commitment had to be. I had no idea of how far reaching the effects of getting close to God would be for me, or how difficult it would be on others to allow me to go there. At the age of 19, I was called to serve a mission for the LDS Church in England. This was one of the greatest experiences of my life. Since then, I have always felt that it doesn't matter who you are or what religious understanding you have. If you are able to dedicate your life to serving others and to serving God, you are going to grow and have many spiritual experiences. And so it was true of my experiences in England. There I learned to love people who were a lot less fortunate than I, and to give of myself when I felt there was nothing left to give, to go the extra mile and make a difference in people's lives. Miracles happened weekly where I witnessed healings and blessings in the lives of others. I was miraculously preserved from harm many times, and often given the gift to look into people's lives or hearts and see what was troubling them. The hardest transition of my life was to come home and get back into the rat race of earning a living. I can remember praying when I got home and saying, Lord, if you are going to take my life, do it now, for I feel that I am at the peak of my spiritual growth. At that point, I could not see myself ever again living on the spiritual level that I had found as a missionary. For the first 38 years of my life, I tried to make the spiritual experiences happen. This I did by trying to live every law or rule that I had learned in church and in the scriptures. Although at times I experienced a form of godliness or spirituality, I still did not feel I was having encounters that brought me to a greater closeness or oneness with God. It seemed as though I was stuck on a spiritual plateau and that the people around me were at the same point. I could see that almost all of the individuals I met were content where they were spiritually and had little desire to progress or move forward into what they considered the unknown. It is probably complacency or the easiness of drifting along that lets people get stuck in the limitations of a just go to church rut. I have always been surprised at how content people are to stay in their daily and weekly routines with little desire to find out more about the unknown. After a long struggle with what seemed to be minimal results, I began to get a bit discouraged with the whole process of growing spiritually. This was probably due in part to the fact that I kept reading in the scriptures about spiritual gifts that the righteous possessed, and I didn't seem to have or be experiencing any, especially not on a daily basis. Even my closest friends didn't display any of these gifts in their lives. The church that I grew up in claimed to have the gifts of the Spirit, but I rarely saw them manifest by the church members as displayed by the early apostles of Christ or members of the early Christian church. With greater and deeper discouragement, I found myself turning to God more often in prayer and pleading for guidance and help. I find it hard to describe what this feeling of frustration is like. It's not that I was totally unhappy, but rather that my life was lacking purpose. I wasn't making progress. Surely there had to be more to life than the everyday go to work and come home, do my church assignments, and love my family. My foundation, or that which I had trusted in, which I realized later was mostly based on the precepts or concepts of men, was coming up short. I began to doubt that anyone was having the spiritual experiences witnessed by the early Christian saints. Through my church teachings, I was taught that to seek and know God was not wrong. In fact, it was generally encouraged, but I couldn't find anyone that would say that they had met the Lord. Trust and truth were words I began to dissect in my mind. Was truth something that I could actually put my finger on? And was it the same for everyone? Or was it something that was relative to me and the reality I was creating through my actions and thoughts? If the latter were true, then how could I even trust the written word which translators may have exaggerated and even fabricated to some degree? And what about the interpretation that each of us makes when we see or read something? Finding the true intent of the individual putting forth their viewpoint on something was difficult and at best subject to many angles or levels of understanding. I felt so confused about the whole matter that I really wanted to back off, to somehow walk away and start all over from scratch. If I had not witnessed some spiritual experiences, I probably would have given up on the whole thing, or tried to ignore the problem out of existence. Still, deep within me was a longing for the warmth and love that the Spirit brings. I kept going back to that 2-year period in my mission when I had dedicated myself to the service of God. It was the only time when I had really found continual joy. This caused me to reflect on what made this time so special. What brought the joy I had felt then, and why was I not feeling it now? I am sure some will argue that I was delivering the truth to a world that didn't have it, and God was blessing me with a peace that kept me content in this endeavor. But inside I knew there was more. Something was different then from now, and it went much deeper. Somehow I had to put my finger on it. As I wrestled with this problem, I noticed that my prayers started to change. They began to feel more sincere, and I found myself pleading with the Lord to show me what I was doing wrong and help me see what was stopping my spiritual progression. While praying, I often said, Lord, take away from me everything that is keeping me from seeing you. Although I felt that if taken literally, this statement could mean that I may give up all that I thought was of value in my life. Still, the desire to penetrate the barrier continued to push me forward and drive me to some sort of peace with regard to the matter. Through all the confusion, I somehow knew deep within my heart that God would somehow open things up for me. I remember one time as I was pouring my heart out to God for help, I suddenly stopped in mid-sentence and began to cry. I felt overcome with sadness that somehow I was letting God down, that I was failing the test or experiences of this physical existence. At that moment, all I could see of my life was the failings and lack of progress. It was as if in some way I had been rejected by my Maker and that my offering to God was not complete enough. But what else could I give? Had I not been willing to put all I had on the altar? As I wept, I pleaded for an answer. Precisely how much time elapsed, I'm not sure, for I felt caught up in the anguish of failure. As I continued to sink into my own manufactured hell, I felt a burning or tingling sensation gradually cover my whole being, and a great joy welled up in my chest. It was as if a blanket of peace had slowly been rolled over me, and I was encompassed by some power I had felt many times before, in brief moments. But now it was stronger and more focused as it moved through me and enveloped my emotions. Instantly, I felt my mind clear and a serene calm wash over me. It was wonderful. At this point, I heard no voice nor saw any heavenly being, but I had a comforting reassurance and confidence that all things were in God's hands and would work out for my best good. I knew that God was aware of me and that in time the answers would come. This experience helped me see that I was not forgotten, that none of us are forgotten, nor can we be. My direction now took a bit of a change, and I sought to have this warm, reassuring feeling guide me in all I did. As I faced the cares of everyday life, I tried to hold on to the feeling of comfort whenever I noticed it starting to leave. With practice, you can become very aware of when the Spirit of God or the feeling of love is with you and when it is not. Or maybe I should say when it is strong and when it is not. This practice also reveals the things that drive the Spirit away in your life. I noticed that I was becoming aware of everything that was going on around me, not from what I saw or the physical experiences, but how I felt. I now found that if I would ask in prayer concerning a decision I had just made, or one I was about to make, I would often get the feeling of comfort or a witness of the Spirit, as it was known in my church, to help me know which direction to go. If I got a spiritual witness, then I would stick with the decision. If I didn't get the witness, then I would drop it, or forget what I had asked about. This led me to trust the love feeling or spirit with everything I did. I also found that many people began to think I was crazy and radical. Business friends started to treat me a little differently when I shared what was happening in my life. I was no longer asked to participate in company gatherings, and clients began to act strictly businesslike. Still, I persisted in following the Spirit, for it kept bringing peace to my mind and heart, even though at times, I must admit, I too wondered if I was losing it. By the warmth of the Spirit, I was directed to many books that helped me learn the deeper meanings of life, and I began to see that if I wanted to have the experiences I had read about others having, I would have to make a full-time commitment to doing God's will. This did not mean that I would have to become a monk or preacher or priest, but rather I would put my desire for godliness ahead of all else. By now I could look back at my life and see that all the highs and lows were there for a reason. They each had purpose, and in some way, however small it may have seemed at the time, I was growing from each peak and each valley. I tried to program my mind so that I looked at all things as for my good, to see everything as being in divine order and for the good of not just myself, but all those I influenced. This helped me to plow through the rough things the Spirit directed me to do and still keep a positive attitude. I began looking for the good in everyone and not caring what the world thought. It was coming down to me and the Spirit, and let the rest of the world worry about their own relationship with God. In other words, I couldn't let what others thought dictate what I believed or how I acted upon that belief. There is a very shocking reality that hits you when you sincerely try not to let others influence what you say, do, or think about. For me, what came home hardest was just how much I was being affected by those around me. It seemed that 98% of what I was doing in life was the direct result of my contact with others. And this contact meant I was behaving a certain way because I was pre-programmed by my environment to act that way. Not realizing it, I really thought that was how people wanted me to act, or that I would gain the acceptance of others by displaying character traits they approved. It seems a bit silly now, but at the time I became very aware of the reasons behind my everyday actions. I dissected my behavior and the thoughts I was thinking to justify that behavior. When you do this sincerely, your personality will change very rapidly. The scripture, praise God in all things, took on a new meaning, and I asked myself which part of my experiences was not included in all things. I came to the conclusion that there was not one solitary thing happening to me for which I could not thank God and give Him the glory. Merlin Crowther's book, From Prison to Praise, was a big help. When you can look at the mistakes of your own life with true objectivity as a third person, you become more forgiving of others, and then you can see the purpose in what is happening in your own life. The divinity of it all becomes overwhelming. At this point, my faith and understanding of God were beginning to grow, even if still small. A seed was there that I began to water and nurture in a most tender way. Rather than rely on my own ability to get through problems, I began to put the burden on God and let Him take care of them. Some people assumed I had a don't care attitude because when I was pushed into a corner or felt stuck solving a problem, I would back away and place it at God's feet. As I did this, I noticed that it always came out in my best interest and long term growth, even if I didn't see it at the moment. But in time, as I looked back, I could see the hand of divine intervention in every part. Thank you, Lord, and thank you, Father, were words I could not say often enough. However, I began to choke on those words as the reality of my excommunication court came rushing back to the forefront of my thinking. I need your help, Father. I so need your help. My nervousness at the moment was a dead giveaway that I had put a lot of value on my church membership. Only by sinking back into my spiritual experiences could I relax and leave the present turmoil.